Ever looked up at the night sky and wondered if we're truly alone? I have. And tonight, I want to tell you a story about what might happen if we weren't. A story about a human, a misunderstanding of cosmic proportions, and a galactic law enforcer with a very strict interpretation of the rules. This is a tale of mistaken identity, interstellar law, and the surprising resilience of the human spirit. This is a story about the day Earthling Jonathan Miller became the most wanted. Well, let's just say, the most wanted being in the galaxy. Imagine this: you're on vacation. You've saved up for years, finally booked that dream trip to the Andromeda Galaxy. You're picturing swirling nebulae, alien landscapes, maybe even a close encounter of the friendly kind. You're Jonathan Miller, a mild-mannered accountant from Ohio, and you're about to have your vacation plans drastically, violently, and hilariously derailed. Jonathan wasn't looking for trouble. He just wanted to see the universe. He'd always been fascinated by the stars, devouring every science fiction novel he could get his hands on. He dreamed of exploring alien worlds, meeting strange and wonderful creatures. He'd even packed a phrasebook with common galactic greetings, just in case. His first stop was Xylos, a vibrant planet known for its floating cities and exotic flora. Jonathan was in awe. The architecture defied gravity, shimmering structures of crystal and light drifting lazily through the pastel-colored sky. The air hummed with the sound of alien music, a symphony of chimes and whistles. He sampled the local cuisine, a bioluminescent fruit that tasted like a cross between a mango and a raspberry, and bought a souvenir, a small, furry creature with 6 legs that he named Trippy. Everything was going perfectly. Too perfectly, perhaps. Meanwhile, light years away, on a hulking warship patrolling the fringes of known space, Officer Krell was having a bad day. Actually, scratch that. Krell was having a bad century. He was a Krillian, a species known for their unwavering adherence to the Galactic Codex, a set of laws so complex and convoluted that even the Krillians themselves barely understood them. Krell, however, was a stickler. He believed in the Codex with every fiber of his being, and he enforced it with an almost religious zeal. He was, to put it mildly, not a fun guy. Krell had received a tip, a whisper in the galactic underworld, about a fugitive hiding out in the Andromeda Galaxy. A dangerous criminal, wanted for a long list of offenses, including, but not limited to, unauthorized parking on a Class 4 moon, littering in a nebula, and most heinous of all, singing karaoke off-key. The fugitive's name was Zorgan the Zealous, and Krell was determined to bring him to justice. The tip was vague, but it mentioned a human planet, a backwater world called Earth. Krell scoffed. Humans. Primitive, unpredictable, and always causing trouble. He'd dealt with them before, usually for minor infractions like smuggling Earth artifacts or accidentally setting off intergalactic firecrackers. But this was different. This was Zorgan. Krell's ship, the Ironclad, dropped out of hyperspace near Xylos. He scanned the planet, his sensors searching for any trace of Zorgan. The scan picked up a faint energy signature, something unusual. It was coming from a human. Krell frowned. Humans weren't known for their unique energy signatures. They were, energetically speaking, about as exciting as a wet sock. But this signature. It was fluctuating, erratic, almost alien. He narrowed his search, focusing on the human in question. The ship's computer identified him as Jonathan Miller, tourist. Krell raised an eyebrow. A tourist? That was unlikely. Zorgan was a master of disguise, known for his ability to blend in anywhere. A tourist was the perfect cover. Krell's suspicions were aroused. He ordered a closer scan, running Jonathan's biosignature through the galactic database. The results came back inconclusive. There were similarities, faint echoes, of Zorgan's unique biosignature. It could be a coincidence, of course. But Krell wasn't one to take chances. He hailed Xylos's planetary authorities, requesting permission to land. He explained that he was searching for a fugitive, and that he had reason to believe the fugitive was on the planet. The Xylosians, eager to cooperate with the Krillian enforcers, granted him permission. Krell landed the ironclad near the bustling spaceport, his armored form casting a long shadow across the alien marketplace. Jonathan, meanwhile, was having the time of his life. He just finished a tour of the Crystal Gardens, a breathtaking display of sentient plants that communicated through light and music. He was snapping pictures with Trippy, the six-legged creature perched on his shoulder. He was so engrossed in his sightseeing that he didn't notice the massive Krillian warship descending from the sky. He didn't notice the heavily armed Krillian guards marching through the marketplace, their laser rifles held at the ready. He certainly didn't notice Krell. His eyes narrowed, scanning the crowd, until Krell's gaze locked onto him. Krell stopped dead in his tracks. The human. It was him. The energy signature, the subtle fluctuations, the faint echoes of Zorgan's biosignature, it all added up. He was certain. This was Zorgan. In disguise, of course. But Krell was too experienced to be fooled by a simple disguise. He raised his hand, signaling his guards. "Seize him!" he barked, his voice amplified by his armor's vocoder. "That's Zorgan the Zealous." Jonathan, startled by the commotion, turned around. He saw the Krillian guards, their weapons pointed directly at him. He saw Krell, his face a mask of grim determination. He saw Trippy, suddenly very interested in a nearby vendor's stall selling glowing space rocks. Jonathan blinked. "Me?" he stammered. "But I'm just a tourist." Krell wasn't listening. He wasn't interested in explanations. He had his man. Or at least, he thought he did. The guards moved in, their hands reaching for Jonathan. Jonathan, completely bewildered, instinctively ducked, avoiding their grasp. He stumbled backward, bumping into a nearby stall. A stack of glowing space rocks tumbled to the ground, shattering into 1,000 pieces. The marketplace erupted in chaos. Krell, momentarily distracted by the commotion, lost sight of Jonathan. When he regained his focus, the human was gone. He scanned the crowd, his eyes searching for any sign of Jonathan. But the human had vanished, seemingly into thin air. Krell cursed under his breath. Zorgan was slippery, he had to give him that. But he wouldn't get away. Not this time. Krell was determined to capture Zorgan, even if he had to tear the entire planet apart to do it. Jonathan, meanwhile, was hiding behind a stack of alien carpets, his heart pounding in his chest. He had no idea what was going on. He was just a tourist. He hadn't done anything wrong. He peeked out from behind the carpets, watching the Krillian guards search the marketplace. He had to get out of there. He had to escape. But where could he go? He was on an alien planet, surrounded by strange creatures and armed guards. He was alone, confused, and very, very scared. And that's where our story begins. What will happen to Jonathan? Will he be able to convince Krell that he's not Zorgan? Or will he be mistaken for a galactic fugitive and thrown into a Krillian prison? And what about Zorgan? Is he really on Xylos? Or is Krell barking up the wrong tree? Find out in the next part of our story, where Jonathan's vacation takes a turn for the intergalactic, and where Krell's pursuit of justice might just lead him down a very, very wrong path. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss the next installment of The Alien Enforcer Mistakes a Human Tourist for a Galactic Fugitive. Because this is just the beginning of Jonathan's incredible, and incredibly confusing adventure. Jonathan huddled behind the stack of shimmering Xylosian carpets, his breath catching in his throat. He could hear the heavy thud of the Krillian guards' boots as they stomped through the marketplace, their voices a guttural rumble in the alien tongue. He gripped Trippy tighter, the little creature trembling in his hand. He had to think, he had to act. Panic wouldn't help him now. He needed a plan. His mind raced, flipping through the pages of his travel guide, searching for any information about Krillian law enforcement. He remembered reading something about their strict adherence to the Galactic Codex, their unwavering belief in justice, and their tendency to shoot first and ask questions later. That wasn't encouraging. He also recalled a passage about Silatian customs, mentioning their respect for personal space and their aversion to loud noises. Maybe, just maybe, he could use that to his advantage. He peeked out from behind the carpets again. The guards were getting closer, their laser rifles gleaming menacingly. He noticed a small, cluttered stall nearby, filled with exotic trinkets and strange devices. An idea sparked in his mind. It was a long shot, but it was better than nothing. He took a deep breath, trying to calm his racing heart. He had to be brave. He was Jonathan Miller, mild-mannered accountant from Ohio, and he was about to face the biggest challenge of his life. He squeezed Trippy gently, offering a silent apology for dragging him into this mess. Then, he made a run for it. He darted between the stalls, dodging bewildered Silatians and startled vendors. He weaved through the crowd, his small stature allowing him to slip through gaps that the larger Krillian guards couldn't navigate. He heard their shouts behind him, their heavy footsteps pounding on the cobblestones. He didn't look back. He just kept running. He reached the cluttered stall and ducked inside, knocking over a display of singing crystals in the process. The crystals chimed and vibrated, emitting a cacophony of discordant melodies. The stall owner, a small, furry creature with large, expressive eyes, glared at him with annoyance. Jonathan gave him an apologetic shrug and started rummaging through the stall, searching for anything that could help him. He found a small, handheld device that looked like a cross between a flashlight and a ray gun. He picked it up, examining it curiously. There was a small label on the side, written in Silatian. He couldn't read the language, but he recognized a few symbols that looked familiar. He vaguely remembered seeing them in his travel guide, in the section about Silatian technology. He pressed a button on the device, and it emitted a low hum. Just then, the Krillian guards burst into the stall. They pointed their laser rifles at Jonathan, their faces grim. "Freeze!" one of them shouted in Krillian. Jonathan didn't understand the language, but he understood the tone. He raised his hands slowly, trying to appear non-threatening. He held the strange device in his other hand, unsure of what it did. The guards moved closer, their eyes fixed on him. Jonathan braced himself for the worst. He closed his eyes, waiting for the inevitable. But then, something unexpected happened. The stall owner, the small, furry creature, stepped forward, blocking the guard's path. He started chattering at them in Silatian, his voice rising in anger. He gestured wildly at the broken crystals, then pointed at Jonathan, then back at the crystals again. Jonathan didn't understand what he was saying, but he could tell that the stall owner was defending him. He was arguing that Jonathan wasn't a criminal, that he was just a clumsy tourist who had accidentally damaged his merchandise. The Krillian guards listened to the stall owner's tirade, their expressions unreadable. They seemed hesitant to use force in the presence of a Silatian citizen. The stall owner continued his impassioned speech, his voice growing louder and more insistent. The guards exchanged glances, their confusion evident. Finally, one of them lowered his weapon slightly. He spoke to the stall owner in Krillian, his tone conciliatory. The stall owner replied with a sharp retort, shaking his head vehemently. The guards seemed to back down. They holstered their weapons and turned to leave the stall, muttering to each other in Krillian. Jonathan watched them go, his heart still pounding in his chest. He couldn't believe it. The stall owner had saved him. He turned to the small, furry creature, offering a grateful smile. "Thank you," he said in English, hoping the sentiment would transcend the language barrier. The stall owner looked at him for a moment, then shrugged and went back to picking up the broken crystals. Jonathan chuckled softly. He had a feeling he was going to like Xylos. He slipped out of the stall, unnoticed by the retreating guards. He still had to get out of the marketplace, but he was no longer being actively pursued. He blended back into the crowd, trying to look like a normal tourist. He decided to head back to his hotel, a small, unassuming establishment on the outskirts of the city. He needed to lie low for a while, figure out what to do next. As he walked, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. He glanced over his shoulder, but saw nothing suspicious. He shrugged it off, attributing it to his nerves. He was just paranoid, he told himself. Everything was going to be all right. Meanwhile, Krell stood on the bridge of the ironclad, staring out at the city of Xylos. He was frustrated. He had lost his target, Zorgan the Zealous, right under his nose. He had questioned the stall owner, but the small creature had been uncooperative, claiming that the human was just a harmless tourist. Krell didn't believe it. He was convinced that the human was Zorgan, in disguise. He just needed proof. He ordered his computer to run another scan of the planet, focusing on the human's energy signature. He wanted to know where he was, what he was doing. The computer reported that the human had checked into a hotel on the outskirts of the city. Krell frowned. A tourist hotel? That was too convenient. Zorgan was playing him for a fool. He decided to pay the hotel a visit. He gathered a squad of guards and boarded a shuttle, heading down to the planet's surface. He was determined to capture Zorgan, no matter what it took. He had a reputation to uphold. He was Krell, the enforcer, and he never gave up. Jonathan reached his hotel, a small, unassuming building with a flickering neon sign. He went inside, relieved to be out of the bustling marketplace. He went up to his room, a small, sparsely furnished space with a view of the city. He closed the door behind him and leaned against it, taking a deep breath. He was safe, for now. He sat down on the bed, feeling exhausted. He still couldn't believe what had happened. He had been mistaken for a galactic fugitive. It was absurd, ridiculous. He had to clear his name, prove that he was just a tourist. But how? He didn't know where to start. He looked at Trippy, who was curled up on the pillow, fast asleep. He smiled. At least he had Trippy. The little creature was his only companion in this strange and dangerous world. He reached out and stroked Trippy's soft fur. The creature stirred slightly, then went back to sleep. Jonathan decided to get some rest. He was tired and confused, and he needed time to think. He lay down on the bed, closing his eyes. He drifted off to sleep, his mind filled with images of Krillian guards and singing crystals. Krell's shuttle landed near the hotel. He stepped out, his face grim. He had a feeling that Zorgan was here. He led his guards into the hotel, their weapons at the ready. He approached the front desk, where a small, robotic receptionist was polishing its metallic surface. He showed the receptionist a picture of Jonathan. "Have you seen this human?" he asked in Krillian. The receptionist scanned the picture, then nodded. "Yes," it said in a monotone voice. "He checked in earlier today. Room 304. Krell nodded. "Thank you," he said. He turned to his guards. "Let's go," he said. They headed towards the stairs, their footsteps echoing through the quiet hotel. Jonathan was asleep, dreaming of home. He was back in Ohio, sitting at his desk, working on his taxes. He was surrounded by spreadsheets and receipts, but he didn't mind. He was happy, content. He was safe. Suddenly, he heard a loud banging on his door. He startled awake, his heart pounding in his chest. He sat up, his eyes wide with fear. The banging on the door grew louder, more insistent. Jonathan scrambled off the bed, his mind racing. It had to be the Krillians. They had found him. He glanced around the room, searching for an escape route. The window. He could try to climb down the fire escape. It was a long shot, but it was his only chance. He grabbed Trippy, who was still half asleep, and rushed to the window. He threw it open and peered out. The fire escape was a rickety metal structure clinging to the side of the building. It looked precarious, but he had no choice. He climbed out onto the fire escape, Trippy clinging tightly to his shoulder. Just as he was about to start climbing down, the door to his room burst open. Krell and 2 Krillian guards stormed in, their laser rifles raised. They saw Jonathan at the window and immediately opened fire. Laser blasts whizzed past him, narrowly missing his head. He ducked down, scrambling further out onto the fire escape. He started climbing down, the metal steps creaking and groaning under his weight. The Krillians continued to fire at him, their laser blasts scorching the wall beside him. He could hear Krell shouting at him in Krillian, but he didn't understand the words. He just kept climbing, his heart pounding in his chest. He reached the first landing and paused, catching his breath. He looked up and saw the Krillians peering down at him from the window, their faces grim. They were reloading their weapons. He had to move, and fast. He continued climbing down, his hands and feet slipping on the rusty metal. He could hear the Krillians chasing after him, their heavy boots clanging on the fire escape above. He glanced down and saw that he was still several stories above the ground. It was a long way to fall. He reached another landing and stopped again, his legs trembling. He was exhausted, but he couldn't give up. He had to keep going. He looked up and saw that the Krillians were gaining on him. They were almost at his level. He took a deep breath and started climbing again, moving as fast as he could. He could hear the Krillians shouting behind him, their voices getting closer. He knew they were about to catch him. He reached the ground floor and jumped off the fire escape, landing heavily on his feet. He stumbled, then regained his balance and started running. He didn't know where he was going, he just wanted to get away from the Krillians. He ran through the back streets of the city, dodging startled Xylosians and overflowing trash bins. He could hear the Krillians chasing after him, their heavy footsteps echoing through the narrow streets. He glanced over his shoulder and saw them gaining on him. They were just a few meters behind him. He turned a corner and found himself in a small, deserted alleyway. He stopped, panting, his chest heaving. He was trapped. The alleyway was a dead end. He looked around frantically, searching for an escape route. But there was nowhere to go. The Krillians appeared at the entrance to the alleyway, their laser rifles pointed at him. Krell stepped forward, his face a mask of triumph. "You can't escape, Zorgan," he said in Krillian. "It's over." Jonathan raised his hands slowly, surrendering. He knew he was caught. He had nowhere left to run. He looked at Trippy, who was trembling in his arms. He felt a pang of guilt for putting the little creature in danger. Krell approached him, his eyes narrowed. "You're under arrest," he said. "For violating the Galactic Codex." Jonathan didn't understand the language, but he understood the meaning. He nodded slowly, accepting his fate. He knew he was going to be taken to a Krillian prison, where he would be interrogated and possibly tortured. He didn't know what the future held for him, but he knew it wasn't going to be good. The Krillian guards moved in, grabbing Jonathan's arms. They handcuffed him and started to lead him away. Jonathan looked back at Trippy, who was watching him with wide, frightened eyes. He felt a surge of sadness. He didn't know if he would ever see Trippy again. As the Krillians were leading him out of the alleyway, Jonathan noticed something strange. One of the guards was holding a small, glowing device in his hand. Jonathan recognized the device. It was the same device he had found in the stall earlier that day. The device that he had used to accidentally break the singing crystals. The guard pressed a button on the device, and it emitted a low hum. Suddenly, the ground started to shake. The Krillians looked around in surprise, their eyes wide with fear. The shaking grew stronger, more violent. Buildings started to crumble, and debris fell from the sky. The Krillians panicked, dropping their weapons and running for cover. Krell looked at Jonathan, his face filled with rage. "What did you do?" he shouted in Krillian. Jonathan didn't know what he had done. He hadn't touched the device. He was just as surprised as the Krillians. But he had a feeling that the device was responsible for the earthquake. He had a feeling that it was some kind of weapon, or maybe even a self-destruct mechanism. The earthquake grew even stronger, and the alleyway started to collapse. Jonathan and the Krillians were trapped. They were surrounded by falling debris, and there was no way out. Jonathan closed his eyes, bracing himself for the end. He didn't know if he would survive, but he knew one thing: he was going to face his fate with courage. He was Jonathan Miller, mild-mannered accountant from Ohio, and he wasn't going to let a little earthquake, or a misunderstanding with a Krillian enforcer, ruin his vacation. Well, maybe it already had. But he wasn't going down without a fight. Or at least, without a bewildered sigh and a muttered, "Well, this is just typical." The world around Jonathan dissolved into a chaotic ballet of crumbling buildings and flying debris. The earthquake, triggered by the mysterious device, had escalated from a tremor to a full-blown planetary crisis. Krillian guards, moments before his captors, now scrambled for survival alongside him, their laser rifles forgotten in the face of imminent destruction. Jonathan, still handcuffed, clung to Trippy, the little creature squeaking in terror. He felt a strange mix of fear and disbelief. He'd come to Xylos for sightseeing, not to witness the planet tearing itself apart. Just as a particularly large chunk of masonry crashed down near him, a low, guttural roar echoed through the collapsing alleyway. It wasn't the sound of crumbling buildings. It was something else. Something organic, powerful, and utterly terrifying. From the dust and rubble emerged a creature of nightmare. It was tall, at least twice the height of Krell, with thick, chitinous armor, razor-sharp claws, and glowing red eyes that seemed to burn with malevolent intelligence. It was a Xylosian razorback, a creature of legend, thought to exist only in the deepest, unexplored regions of the planet. Now it was here, in the middle of the city, awakened by the earthquake and clearly not happy. The razorback surveyed the scene, its gaze falling upon the terrified Krillians. It let out another roar, a sound that vibrated through Jonathan's bones. The Krillian guards, despite their advanced weaponry, were no match for this creature. They scattered, their screams echoing through the collapsing alleyway. Krell, however, stood his ground. He raised his laser rifle, aiming at the razorback's glowing eyes. He fired, a bright beam of energy lancing through the air. The razorback barely flinched. The laser blast seemed to bounce harmlessly off its thick armor. The creature lunged, its movements surprisingly swift for its size. It swiped its massive claw, sending 2 Krillian guards flying through the air like rag dolls. They crashed into a pile of rubble, unconscious or worse. Krell fired again, this time aiming at the razorback's legs. The creature stumbled slightly, but quickly regained its footing. It turned its attention to Krell, its red eyes burning with fury. Jonathan watched in horror as the razorback advanced on Krell. He knew the Krillian enforcer was no match for this creature. He had to do something, anything. But what could he do? He was handcuffed, unarmed, and trapped in a collapsing alleyway with a monstrous creature. He looked at Trippy, who was trembling in his arms. An idea sparked in his mind. It was crazy, reckless, and probably suicidal, but it was the only thing he could think of. He took a deep breath and shouted at the top of his lungs, "Hey! Over here!" The razorback turned its head, its glowing eyes fixing on Jonathan. It let out a deafening roar and charged towards him. Jonathan braced himself for the impact, closing his eyes and squeezing Trippy tightly. The Razorback was almost upon him when something even more unexpected happened. A beam of light shot down from the sky, striking the Razorback in the back. The creature roared in pain and stumbled, its attention diverted. Jonathan opened his eyes and saw a spaceship descending rapidly towards the alleyway. It was a sleek, silver vessel, unlike anything he had ever seen before. It hovered above the alleyway, its engines emitting a low hum. A ramp extended from the spaceship, and a figure emerged. It was tall and slender, wearing a silver uniform. The figure raised their hand, and another beam of light shot down from the ship, striking the Razorback again. The creature roared in fury and turned to face the spaceship. The figure on the ramp spoke, their voice amplified by a loudspeaker. Razorback, you are in violation of the Galactic Codex, Article 7, Subsection 3, Paragraph 12, the voice said. Destruction of property and endangering sentient life. You are hereby ordered to cease your attack and surrender immediately. Jonathan stared in disbelief. This was getting crazier and crazier. First, he was mistaken for a galactic fugitive, then he was caught in an earthquake, and now he was witnessing a spaceship battle a giant monster in a collapsing alleyway. He couldn't believe this was happening. The Razorback roared defiantly and charged towards the spaceship. The figure on the ramp raised their hand again, and a barrage of energy blasts rained down on the creature. The Razorback was no match for the spaceship's weaponry. It was forced to retreat, its thick armor finally starting to show signs of damage. The figure on the ramp turned to Jonathan. Are you all right? They asked. Jonathan nodded, still speechless. Yes, he managed to say. Thank you? The figure smiled. Don't mention it, they said. We've been tracking you for a while now. We know you're not Zorgan the Zealous. Jonathan blinked. You do? He asked. Yes, the figure said. We know who you are. You're Jonathan Miller, a tourist from Earth. Jonathan was stunned. How do you know that? He asked. That's not important right now, the figure said. What's important is that we get you out of here. The planet is unstable. It could collapse at any moment. Jonathan nodded. He was ready to leave. He had had enough of Xylos. He just wanted to go home. He looked at Trippy, who was still trembling in his arms. He smiled. At least he had a good story to tell when he got back to Ohio. If he got back. The figure on the ramp gestured towards the spaceship. Come on, they said. Let's go. Jonathan hesitated. What about Krell? He asked. He's still down there. The figure shrugged. He'll have to fend for himself, they said. We don't have time to rescue everyone. Jonathan frowned. He didn't like the idea of leaving Krell behind, even after everything that had happened. But he knew the figure was right. They had to get out of there. He followed the figure up the ramp and into the spaceship. The ramp closed behind him, and the ship's engines roared to life. The spaceship lifted off, leaving the collapsing alleyway behind. Jonathan looked out the window and saw the city of Xylos crumbling beneath him. He shook his head in disbelief. He couldn't believe what had happened. His vacation had turned into a nightmare. And it was far from over. He still had to clear his name, figure out why he was mistaken for Zorgan, and now deal with this mysterious figure who seemed to know everything about him. Who were they? And what did they want? The questions swirled in his mind as the spaceship soared into the vast expanse of space, leaving the doomed planet behind. The sleek silver spaceship accelerated away from Xylos, leaving the crumbling planet behind. Jonathan, still reeling from the events of the past few hours, sat in a comfortable seat, clutching Trippy tightly. He looked at the figure who had rescued him, trying to make sense of everything. Who are you? He finally asked. And how did you know I wasn't Zorgan? The figure smiled enigmatically. My name is Lyra, she said. And as for how I knew you weren't Zorgan, well, let's just say we've been keeping an eye on him for a while now. He's been causing quite a bit of trouble across the galaxy. And you knew I was just a tourist? Jonathan asked. Lyra nodded. We scanned your ship when it entered the Xylos system. We know everything about you, Jonathan Miller. Jonathan felt a chill run down his spine. Everything? He asked. Yes, Lyra said. Your job, your family, your unusual fascination with alien cultures. Jonathan shifted uncomfortably. He felt like he was being watched, like his privacy had been invaded. Why are you helping me? He asked. Because you're innocent, Lyra said. And because Zorgan is still out there. We need your help to catch him. Jonathan blinked. My help? He asked. But I'm just a tourist. I don't know anything about galactic law enforcement. You know more than you think, Lyra said. You were mistaken for him, after all. That gives you a unique perspective. Jonathan frowned. He didn't like the idea of being involved in some galactic manhunt. He just wanted to go home. But he also knew that he couldn't just ignore what had happened. Zorgan was a dangerous criminal, and he had to be stopped. What do you want me to do? Jonathan asked. We need you to help us track him down, Lyra said. He's a master of disguise, but we believe he's still in the Andromeda Galaxy. We think he might be trying to leave the galaxy altogether. And how am I supposed to help with that? Jonathan asked. You're going to act as bait, Lyra said. Jonathan stared at her in disbelief. Bait? He asked. You want me to be bait for Zorgan? Lyra nodded. It's the only way, she said. Zorgan thinks you're him. He'll come after you. Jonathan swallowed hard. He didn't like the idea of being used as bait, but he knew it was the right thing to do. Okay, he said. I'll do it. Lyra smiled. Thank you, Jonathan, she said. You won't regret this. The spaceship jumped into hyperspace, heading towards a remote planet on the edge of the Andromeda Galaxy. Lyra explained that Zorgan was rumored to have a hideout on this planet. It was a desolate, rocky world, sparsely populated and largely ignored by the galactic authorities. It was the perfect place for a fugitive to lie low. When they arrived at the planet, Lyra gave Jonathan a small device. This is a tracker, she said. It will alert us when Zorgan is nearby. Jonathan took the device and clipped it to his belt. He was nervous, but he tried to hide his fear. He was playing a dangerous game, but he was determined to see it through. Lyra dropped him off near a small town on the planet. She told him to blend in, to act like a normal tourist. She would be monitoring him from the spaceship, waiting for Zorgan to make his move. Jonathan walked into the town, trying to appear nonchalant. He visited the local market, bought a few souvenirs, and even tried some of the local cuisine, which tasted suspiciously like recycled space rations. He kept an eye out for anything suspicious, but everything seemed normal. Hours passed, and nothing happened. Jonathan started to wonder if Zorgan had already left the planet. Maybe he had underestimated the fugitive. Maybe Zorgan was smarter than he thought. Just when he was about to give up hope, the tracker on his belt started to beep. It was a faint beep, but Jonathan heard it clearly. He looked around, trying to pinpoint the source of the signal. The beeping grew louder, and Jonathan realized that Zorgan was close. He felt a surge of adrenaline. This was it. The moment he had been waiting for. He turned around and saw a figure approaching him. It was a tall, burly man, wearing a long cloak and a wide-brimmed hat. His face was hidden in the shadows. Jonathan's heart pounded in his chest. He knew this was Zorgan. He could feel it. The figure stopped in front of him. Are you Jonathan Miller? He asked, his voice low and menacing. Jonathan nodded slowly. Zorgan smiled. I've been expecting you, he said. Jonathan braced himself for the worst. He knew Zorgan was going to attack him. He just didn't know when. Suddenly, a beam of light shot down from the sky, striking Zorgan in the chest. He staggered backward, his cloak falling away to reveal his true form. He was a Krillian! Jonathan stared in disbelief. Zorgan was a Krillian? But Krell was a Krillian! Could it be? Before Jonathan could process this revelation, another figure landed beside Zorgan. It was Krell! Zorgan, Krell said, his voice filled with anger. You're under arrest. Zorgan laughed. You'll never catch me, Krell, he said. He pulled out a small device and pressed a button. A portal opened up behind him, swirling with energy. I'm going to another galaxy, Zorgan said. And you'll never see me again. He stepped through the portal and vanished. Krell cursed. He's getting away, he said. He turned to Jonathan. You, he said. You're coming with me. Jonathan was confused. Where? He asked. To Kyll, Krell said. You're going to tell us everything you know about Zorgan. Jonathan sighed. It seemed like he was never going to get rid of this mistaken identity. He was just a tourist. But he knew he had no choice. He had to go with Krell. As they were boarding Krell's ship, Jonathan noticed something glinting on the ground where Zorgan had been standing. He picked it up. It was a small, metallic badge. He examined it closely. It was a Krillian Enforcer badge. And engraved on it was the name Krell. Jonathan's eyes widened. He looked at Krell, who was impatiently waiting for him. It wasn't Zorgan who was the fugitive. It was Krell. He had framed Jonathan, used him as a distraction, while he, the real Zorgan, escaped. The pieces clicked into place. Krell's obsessive pursuit, the convenient tip about Zorgan being on Xylos, the device that caused the earthquake. It was all a setup. Krell was Zorgan. He clutched the badge tightly, a mixture of fear and anger surging through him. He knew he couldn't reveal what he knew yet. He needed proof. He needed to expose Krell's treachery. But how? He was on Krell's ship, heading to Kyll. He was trapped. But Jonathan Miller, the mild-mannered accountant from Ohio, wasn't going to give up. He had been through too much. He had faced down Krillian guards, giant monsters, and collapsing planets. He wasn't going to let a corrupt enforcer get away with framing him. He was going to expose the truth, even if it was the last thing he did. His vacation might be ruined, his life might be in danger, but he was going to bring Krell to justice. He just needed to figure out how. And as the ship jumped into hyperspace, carrying him towards an unknown fate, Jonathan knew that his adventure was far from over. It had just taken a very, very unexpected turn. The hyperspace jump was disorienting, the ship's interior humming with a low, resonant thrum. Jonathan sat quietly, Trippy nestled in his lap, the Krillian Enforcer badge clutched tightly in his hand. He knew he had to be careful. Krell, or rather Zorgan, was a dangerous and cunning individual. He couldn't reveal his suspicions prematurely. He needed a plan, a way to expose the truth without putting himself in further danger. He thought about the events that had led him to this point, the mistaken identity, the earthquake, the Razorback, and now this. It was all so surreal. He was just a tourist, a mild-mannered accountant from Ohio. How had his life become so entangled with galactic fugitives and intergalactic law enforcement? He glanced at Trippy, the little creature blinking up at him with its large, innocent eyes. He smiled faintly. At least he had Trippy. The little creature had been a constant companion through all the chaos. He wondered what his life would be like after all this. Would he ever be able to go back to his old life? Would he ever be able to look at the stars again without thinking about Krillian enforcers and exploding planets? The ship dropped out of hyperspace, and Krell announced that they had arrived at HFY. Jonathan's heart pounded in his chest. He was about to enter the lion's den. He followed Krell off the ship, trying to act like a compliant prisoner. He knew he had to play his part if he wanted to survive. HFY was a stark, imposing planet, dominated by towering metallic structures and a perpetually overcast sky. The air was thick and heavy, and the atmosphere was oppressive. Jonathan felt a sense of dread as he was led through the city streets. The Krillians were a tall, imposing species, with stern faces and an air of unwavering authority. They eyed him with suspicion, their gazes lingering on his human form. He was taken to a large, imposing building, the headquarters of the Krillian enforcers. He was led into a small, sterile room, where he was told to wait. Krell left, saying he would be back shortly. Jonathan sat alone, his mind racing. He had to think fast. He needed a way to expose Krell before it was too late. He looked at the Krillian enforcer badge in his hand. It was a solid piece of metal, with Krell's name engraved on it. He wondered if there was any way to use it as evidence. He examined it closely, looking for anything that could help him. Then, he noticed something. A small, almost invisible inscription on the back of the badge. He squinted at it, trying to make out the words. It was a series of numbers and letters. He realized it was a serial number. He had an idea. He remembered reading in his travel guide about the Krillian enforcers and their meticulous record keeping. Every piece of equipment, every weapon, every badge was registered and tracked. If he could access the enforcer database, he could prove that the badge belonged to Krell. And if he could prove that, he could expose him as Zorgan. But how could he access the database? He was a prisoner, locked in a room with no access to technology. He looked around the room, searching for anything that could help him. Then he saw it. A small ventilation duct in the ceiling. It was just big enough for him to squeeze through. He smiled. It was a long shot, but it was his only chance. He stood up and pushed a chair over to the wall. He climbed onto the chair and reached up to the ventilation duct. He pried open the cover and peered inside. It was dark and dusty, but he could see that it led to another room. He took a deep breath and squeezed through the duct. He crawled through the narrow space, his clothes getting covered in dust and grime. He emerged into another room, a large, dimly lit chamber filled with computer consoles. It was the enforcer database. He quickly located a terminal and sat down. He typed in the serial number from the badge and waited anxiously. The computer whirred and clicked, and finally, the information appeared on the screen. The badge belonged to Krell. But that wasn't all. The database also contained information about Krell's activities, his movements, his contacts. And there it was. Evidence of his dealings with known criminals, including Zorgan. He had been working with Zorgan all along. Jonathan copied the information onto a small data chip that he had found in his pocket. He now had proof that Krell was Zorgan. He just needed to find a way to expose him. He heard footsteps outside the room and quickly closed the database. He climbed back into the ventilation duct and returned to the room where he had been held. He replaced the cover and sat back down, just as Krell entered the room. "Are you ready to talk?" Krell asked, his voice cold and menacing. Jonathan nodded slowly. He knew he had to play along until he had a chance to expose him. Krell led him to another room, a large, imposing chamber with a raised platform at the end. He was led onto the platform, where a group of Krillian enforcers stood waiting. They were all armed and looked very serious. Krell stood before them, his face grim. "This human," he said, "has confessed to being Zorgan the Zealous?" Jonathan's eyes widened in surprise. He had never confessed to anything. Krell was framing him again. The enforcers looked at him with suspicion. Jonathan knew he had to act fast. He pulled out the data chip from his pocket. "I'm not Zorgan," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "I have proof." He held up the data chip. "This chip contains evidence that will expose the real Zorgan," he said. Krell's eyes narrowed. He knew what was on the chip. He lunged towards Jonathan, trying to grab the chip. But Jonathan was too quick. He dodged Krell's grasp and held the chip high above his head. "If you want this chip," he said, "you'll have to tell the truth." Krell hesitated. He knew he was trapped. If he didn't get the chip, his true identity would be revealed. But if he did, he would be admitting his guilt. He looked at the enforcers, who were watching him with suspicion. He knew he had no choice. "All right," he said, his voice tight. "I'll tell you the truth." He confessed everything. He admitted that he was Zorgan, that he had framed Jonathan, that he had been working with criminals across the galaxy. He explained how he had used the earthquake to cover his escape, how he had planned to leave the galaxy altogether. The enforcers were stunned. They couldn't believe that their leader, their most respected officer, was a criminal. They turned to Krell, their faces filled with anger. They stripped him of his badge and his weapons and placed him in handcuffs. Jonathan watched as Krell was led away, his face filled with shame. He had done it. He had exposed the real Zorgan. He had cleared his name. The enforcers thanked Jonathan for his help and apologized for the mistake. They offered to escort him back to Earth, but Jonathan declined. He had one more thing to do. He went to the spaceport and boarded a small transport ship. He set course for Xylos. He had to find Trippy. When he arrived on Xylos, he found the marketplace in ruins. The earthquake had devastated the city. But he didn't give up. He searched through the rubble, calling Trippy's name. Finally, he found him. Trippy was hiding under a pile of debris, scared but unharmed. Jonathan scooped him up in his arms, relieved to have found him. He returned to his hotel, which was also damaged but still standing. He packed his bags and prepared to leave Xylos. He had had enough of alien planets and intergalactic adventures. He was ready to go home. As he was leaving the hotel, he noticed something on the ground. It was a small, furry creature with large, expressive eyes. It was the stall owner from the marketplace. The stall owner looked at Jonathan and smiled. He held out a small, glowing space rock. It was the same kind of rock that Jonathan had accidentally broken earlier. Jonathan took the rock and smiled. He knew what the stall owner was saying. He was thanking him for saving the planet. He thanked the stall owner and boarded his ship. He set course for Earth, his heart filled with relief. He was finally going home. The journey back to Earth was uneventful. Jonathan relaxed and enjoyed the peace and quiet. He thought about everything that had happened. He had been through a lot, but he had learned a lot too. He had learned that even